Welcome to Friday night's video and our Master Series. This is the 15th video in our Master Series and the second video in our editing phase. In the last video we had an introduction into the editing phase, and in this video we're going to talk about the first thing that we should be dealing with in the editing phase. Before we get started, as usual, always save an unedited copy of the song, meaning you have the recording phase, you've saved a copy of that entire deal so that you can go back to the recording phase and fix things. Does that make sense? And that should have been done now. Does that make sense? So that you've cleaned it up and you've got a whole copy of the entire song and its files that's saved in another folder for you to have to, you can go back to that recording phase in case you need a file. And I do that in every phase after I get done working on every phase. And sometimes I save files as I go through. If I'm going to work on a file here, I don't just want, I've done a couple things to the file, and doing the next thing to it might be questionable, and so I'll save a copy of that file in a folder, make a note of it on the file itself, or put a note in the file with it that, well, I messed with the ADSR on this file, and I'm saving a copy of it before I do that because that might not pan out well. That can get kind of tedious, but it can certainly save you some headaches later. So as we get into the editing phase, that we talked about the most important issues: cleaning the tracks up, anomaly repairs, clicks, plops, and bleeps, flow editing, and the first thing that we're going to be dealing with, arrangement. So this is a huge concept for a couple different reasons. The first reason is after you get done recording, that things are probably somewhat in time and where they're supposed to be, depending on how big the arrangement is and how your workflow is. Taking in something like this arrangement here is like 309 tracks. That's a lot of tracks. So getting things arranged, whether or not you got little files like this that are set like that, or they're long, or you squished them up a little bit, shortened them up, the events a little bit, so that they're not big old events depending on how your workflow is, and you've got things pretty much arranged. That way, as you're doing editing, that if you need to compare things against each other as you're editing to see what you might decide as an editing decision because of comparing two different files together, they're going to be working together, or one's coming into another or one's coming out of another, that sometimes you might want to be able to have that set up so that you can compare them before you make an editing decision. So that's very important, especially on a big production or a large production. Like this one's like a movie score production, and it's got a lot of files in it. It's got a lot of things that happen and movements through the entire production, and there's a lot of files. So having it laid out and arranged fairly well is very important for the reasons that I was speaking of. So the arrangement is the next thing that you want to deal with, or I should say the first thing you basically want to deal with in your editing process. This is a hugely important thing because of the reasons that I've spoke of. The whole idea that you've got it set in time fairly where it's supposed to be, and it's arranged fairly well, so that as you go through these things in your editing, that editing the file itself, you don't need to compare it against other files, but there are times that you might have a bass or an oboe and a synth that's I don't know. And, for you to edit that properly, that none of those files really work on themselves. It's not like a dialogue for a sports show. I mean, those things are all got to be edited well together for the whole production to sound like you want it to. So that can be time consuming, frustrating, and tedious sometimes, and a lot of jumping around back and forth to where you get an edited phase and it's set in concrete pretty well. Do this, 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 but you find yourself doing that sometimes. And you just have to remember and make notes about it, to where as you go through this, most of this stuff that we're going to be dealing with, cleaning of the tracks, you don't need to worry about that. Anomaly repair, you don't really need to worry about that too much. Flow editing, you most definitely probably will. That when you start doing your flow editing and you start doing the flow editing, that it most definitely might change, your decision on how you do your flow editing, or fuss with the ADSR or the tail or the attack, because it's working in conjunction with something else. And so it will cause you to actually jump around inside of the production, comparing things to make decisions. And if you save pre-edited files later on, when you start processing and you start mixing, that you can go back. You can go, no, I did that ADSR work on that, but now that it's mixing with that other drum or something, that, well, it doesn't quite sound right. I'm gonna try to edit that a little bit differently. And that can be, like I said, frustrating sometimes, but the better you get at it, the better you'll understand. No, I know that I'm dealing with that drum just like that, and I'm not fussing with it. I know it's going to sound fine. I can hear it in my head that when it's doing that it'll be fine. Sometimes you get really complicated stuff to where it's like a movie score or some really, far out, adventure that you've created that's I don't know, what you might do, but the more complicated it gets, that the more time in the editing phase you'll spend in it before you even get to doing processing and doing mixing, because you got a pretty good understanding what you want to hear, and so that you're going to spend more time fussing with them how they go together. Like, it's not just one Lego, there's 4 or 5 different Legos that are kind of working together, and you have to make editing decisions based on them working together. So you really need to take that in consideration, and that's a huge aspect of why the arrangement of the production at this point is very important, so that it's fairly laid out fairly well. We'll go into time stretching and making sure everything's perfectly in tempo later, but for now, just as close as possible. And you might need to fuss with that as you're doing editing, because you're like, well, no, I need to check this bass against this thing, and it's really got to be perfect in time for me to really make this decision, because I can't really hear it, and I need to go ahead and do that now. And you might skip ahead a little bit every now and then, and just depends on the production, the arrangement, how well you can hear it in your head, and things like that. But to get a pretty good rough draft of the arrangement at this point is fairly important. So that's basically the first phase in the editing process, and to get your arrangement and a rough draft of it. So peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed the second video in our editing phase, and I hope you do a good job of getting your song arranged, and I'll see you in the next video when we start doing some actual editing.